Good morning and welcome to day 5 of our software design and development class. Today is going to be a very short lecture. I just want to talk about a couple of things, and then we will get, during class time, we will get into practicing with HTML and cascading style sheets. Client server we've talked a little bit about already, but I just want to point out a couple more things about that architecture. As we're working and getting started with Ruby on Rails, the first thing we will be working on is a mostly static web page. It doesn't do a great deal, it's not interacting with the database, but it is a little bit different than the standard HTML call and response system that if you've done any work with web browsers, you've already seen. For your traditional web browser call and response, your browser sends a server a URL that has a page at the very end of that URL, and basically the web server looks up that page and sends a copy back to the browser for interpretation and display. And in that case, really actually the browser is doing probably most of the work, because all the router is doing is finding the page and sending it back. When we start working with Ruby on Rails, it gets a little more complicated, and your browser sends the request to the Rails router, and it will then go to the file config/routes, I think it's routes.rb, and it will look up in that document what the corresponding controller is for that page request. So it's interpreting a page request, and it's figuring out, okay, what program within this framework is going to answer that request. Then the controller document runs, the program runs. It's also a .rb file. It runs and it decides what it needs to do. In this case, it's just going to look up a view, which will be a .html.erb file. It will look that up and get that code. It will interpret the embedded Ruby and turn it into a strict HTML page, and it will send back to you via your browser. So it's a few more steps to do even basically a static web page from the Rails standpoint. Generally speaking, this is the division of labor between a client and server system. The client generally has a very small program, and in most cases it is just your browser. It is Chrome or Safari or Microsoft Edge or Firefox or whatever. That simply has to be able to run and understand HTML, and it has to be able to know how to send and receive requests from the appropriate server, and that information is embedded in the URL that you give it or in a link that you click on. But basically that's all it needs to do. Generally the server does the majority of the work, the computation. In this case it takes the embedded Ruby file, it converts it to HTML and sends that back. In more complicated systems it also probably has a database, and it manages the interactions of multiple users. If you've been doing some of the reading, you've probably run into this phrase, a RESTful website or RESTful architecture. If you can imagine a database as a table of records, in this case, if you look at the first line, Mickey Mouse, that is one record that is Mickey Mouse, the address, and the age of that Disney character. We can think of that as a single unit that is a single resource. And so that's kind of an autonomous piece of information that is all closely related. And that's what we mean by the representational state. That's what we want to either get and read and interpret, or we might want to change it, we might want to create it, we might want to delete it. But that is the single piece that we're talking about when we're talking about representational states. There are, in this type of architecture, and it's not the only way of communicating back and forth with information on the web, there are others. This is one of the easier ones to work with and understand. There are only 4 things basically that you really can do. You can create a new record. So if I'm thinking of my database as this table, I can add a new row at the bottom and add, say, Black Widow at the very bottom of this and put in her information. I can also, of course, read it. I can get it and send it to a browser, so you might know her address if you want to go look her up. I can update it and change it, so that would be a different type of request that I might send. I can also delete that record entirely. And depending on the type of database that you're working with, that either might completely erase that information and recover the space by moving the other rows up to kind of fill in the gaps, or it might leave a gap that would have to be cleaned up later on. But basically those 4 actions are what we call by the acronym CRUD: create, read, update, and delete. That's the 4 things you're usually working on when you're working with a database. You might pull that information out, read it, and then use it in some calculations. But as far as the communication between the web page and the database is concerned, really those are those 4 actions that it's going to do. All right, moving on to HTML and cascading style sheets. HTML, it's hypertext markup language, so if you've done any other markup or markdown, it's kind of in that family. It defines a page structure using tag pairs. So it defines that there is a header to a page. It defines that there is a footer to a page. It maybe defines that there's a column over to the left. It may define that there is a main body or a table within that main body. It basically breaks that infinite page, if you want to think of it that way, into regions that are defined by tags, and then you can address them, and you can tell the page what you want to do with them. Or if you're using JavaScript, you can do even more complicated things using those pairs. And some examples that I have here, these are all paired tags. So your header region contains like information about the page, the title. H1 is actually heading, and I apologize right up front because a lot of this wasn't necessarily planned all that well, so there are some terms that are similar. Header and heading are similar, but they're completely different regions on an HTML page. And then one we use an awful lot is div. It stands for division. And so you might have multiple divs in a page and treat them differently and make them look different depending on some other information you include in there. So HTML defines the page structure. Very important. The cascading style sheet defines how that page looks. Now, your browser has some default settings, so if you don't provide a cascading style sheet page, we usually just call it a style sheet. So if you don't provide a style sheet, it knows how to generally display things like the heading 1, and it will use those defaults if nothing else has been specified. But most of the time when you're trying to make nice looking web pages, you will want to have a style sheet because you want to control how it's going to look to a user and not leave that to chance. So I have quite a lot of practice available on HTML and CSS and how those two interact, linked from the Homework 2 assignment. You will probably, or maybe have already started running into embedded Ruby files. I really expect that you'll see them a lot more in Homework 2 and beyond. But they're basically embedded Ruby pages end with a .html.erb. That's not a typo, but that basically says that there's an embedded Ruby that is going to generate an HTML page. And so at the end of its processing, the .erb is taken away, and all that remains is the .html when it sends it to the browser for display. So these embedded Ruby pages, they generate the HTML that is actually finally sent to the browser based on the Ruby code that's in it. There are three basic ways of defining embedded Ruby in these pages. The first one, that execution tag, that simply executes whatever the code is that is within those brackets. And it's important, you've got your angle bracket, %, you do your code, and then you end it with % and the opposite angle bracket. That just executes a line of code. It could be like for each do something. Your end tags, for instance, have to end up in this type of tag. The angle bracket %= is very important. It is different because that basically replaces the result from the Ruby expression into that tag to be displayed. So it's, in a way, it's kind of like the return statement from a method. It's like whatever that evaluates to, that is what will be in the HTML tag at the end. And notice that there is not an % angle bracket. The % only goes in the opening part of the tag. And then finally there is a comment tag, but I don't see those in the .erb files very often. But it is there in case you want to make a comment. And it's just ignored like a sharp sign would be ignored in any Ruby code. So that's what those are, and you'll see them and see how they're used in the Hartle tutorial. So lastly, our notable computer scientist is a prodigy who started writing their first program at age 12. Apparently it was a computer game to help their younger sibling learn some mathematics. Currently Taiwan's digital minister, a major contributor to free software initiatives, mostly around Perl, which is a language that I've used a little bit. This Audrey Tang identifies as postgender, and they say they use whatever pronoun people want to describe them with online, but I generally stick with them because they've indicated they are postgender. So a really cool up-and-coming young person, and I just wanted to introduce you to them. And I will see you in class to practice with HTML and cascading style sheets. So thank you.